So, good morning everyone. Today, I will be discussing the chapter 9, language acquisition, in continuation of the report of Ma'am Marjorie Rivera. So, children deprived a linguistic input show a clear drive to acquire language and may even create a fundamental linguistic system as illustrated by deaf children who create home science, but there is a little doubt that children require a language environment to develop a mature linguistic system. But what exactly is the role of the linguistic input children hear or see in the case of sign? So, one noticeable view suggested by parameter setting models of acquisition is that children use the linguistic data to extract the underlying rules and parameter setting of their language. Other approaches to understanding language acquisition afford a much more pronounced and formative role to the input provided by adults. So, it is especially true of early theories of language acquisition, which were heavily influenced by behaviorism of a school of psychology prevalent in 1950s. As the name implies, behaviorism focus on people's directly observable behaviors rather on the mental system underlying these behaviors. So, language was viewed as a kind of verbal behavior, and it was proposed that children learn language through imitation, reinforcement, analogy, and similar processes. So let's now jump in to the role of imitation, reinforcement, and analogy. So let us listen to a anonymous adult and child conversation. My teacher holded the baby rabbits and we patted them.
Did you say your teacher held the baby rabbit?
Yes,
What did you say she did?
she holded the baby rabbits and we patted them.
Did you say she held them tightly?
No, she holded them loosely. So here, a common misconception about language acquisition is that children simply listen to what is that children simply listen to what is said around them and try to imitate the speech that they hear. So imitation is involved to some extent, of course. So for example, an American child hears milk and a Mexican child hears leche, and each child attempts to reproduce what he hears. So, but children's early words and sentences show that they are not simply imitating adult speech, but many times the words are barely recognized to an adult, and the meanings are also not always like the adults. Moreover, even when children are trying to imitate what they hear, they are unable to produce sentences outside of the rules of their developing grammar. Following are a child's attempts to imitate something the adult has said. So,
He's going out.
he go out.
That's an old time train.
Old time train.
Adam, say what I say. Where can I put them?
Where can I put them? Imitation also fails to account for the fact that children who are unable to speak for neurological or physiological reasons are able to learn the language spoken to them and understand it. When they overcome their speech impairment, they immediately use the language for speaking. So, there's another proposal in the behaviorist tradition that children learn to produce correct grammatical sentences because adults positively reinforce them when they say something grammatical and negatively reinforce them by correction when they say something ungrammatical. But studies show that parents seldom correct their children, and when they do it, it is usually for mispronunciations or incorrect reporting of facts and not for bad grammar. For example, the ungrammatical sentence, her curl my hair, was not corrected because child's mother was in fact curling her hair. However, when the child uttered the grammatical sentence, Walt Disney comes on Tuesday, she was corrected because the television program was shown on Wednesday. So, one researcher concluded that it is truth value rather than syntactic well formness that chiefly governs explicit verbal reinforcement by parents, which renders mildly paradoxical the fact that the usual product of such a training schedule is an adult whose speech is highly grammatical but not notably truthful. And adults will sometimes recast children's utterance into an adult like form, as in the following example. It fall.
It fell?
Where is them?
They're at home.
It doing dancing.
It's dancing, yes.
So in these examples, although recasts are potentially helpful to the child, they are not used in consistent way. So one study of 40 mothers of children 2 to 4 years old showed that only about 25% of children's ungrammatical sentences are recast, and that overall, parents recast grammatical sentences as often as bad ones. Um, because parents focus more on the content than on the form of their children's utterances and allow many ungrammatical utterances to slip by while correcting grammatical ones. A child that relies on recast to learn grammar would be mightily focused. So, children do not know what they are doing wrong and are unable to make correction even when errors are pointed out, as shown by the following exchange. Nobody don't like me.
Say nobody likes me.
Nobody don't like me.
Repeated 8 times. Now, listen carefully. Say nobody likes me.
Oh, nobody don't likes me. So it has also been suggested that children put words together to form phrases and sentences by analogy. So by hearing a sentence and using it as a model to form other sentences. In some sense, this must be true. Children must generalize from particular instances to form a general rule. So in a general rule, but the problem with analogy is that child must also know when the general rule does not work, as one development psycholinguist explains. Suppose the child has heard the sentence, I painted a red barn. So now, by analogy, the child can say, I painted a blue barn. So that's exactly the kind of theory that we want. So you can hear a sample and you extend it to all of the new cases by similarity. So in addition to I painted a red barn, you might also hear the sentence I painted a red bar, red a barn red. So it looks as if you take those last two words and switch their order. So now you want to extend this to the case of seeing, because you want to look at barns instead to paint them. So you have heard I saw a red barn. Now you try By analogy, a new sentence. So, I saw a barn rent. So, something's gone wrong. This is an analogy, but the analogy didn't work. It's not a sentence of English. So, children do not make syntactic error. Children do not make syntactic errors of this sort. They may overgeneralize a morphological rule or omit functional elements, but they seem to know enough about syntactic structure not to assign a uniform analysis to sentences with eat and grow or painted and see. So, each of which has different syntactic properties. So, analogy to the extent it is used by children and must be constrained by the child's knowledge of the general structure principles provided by UG. So, we will now jump in the role of structured input. Another suggestion is that children are able to learn language because adults speak to them in a special simplified. So, language, sometimes called motherese or child directed speech or CDS, or more informally, what we know is baby talk. This hypothesis also places a lot of emphasis on the role of the environment in facilitating language acquisition. In our culture, adults typically talk to young children in a special way. So we tend to speak more slowly and more clearly. And we may also speak in a higher pitch and exaggerate our intonations. And sentences directed to children are generally grammatical. So, infants seem to prefer to listen to mothers over natural mothers over normal adult speech. So, researchers believe that the exaggerated intonation and other properties may be useful for getting child's attention and making salient certain features of language. And also studies show that children's overall language development is not significantly affected by the use of mothers. And the child whose mother uses more features of mothers will not develop language any faster than other child whose mother uses fewer features of this mode of speech.
Si nanay. Si nanay.
Nanay.
Si tatay. Si tatay.
Tatay.
Where do you live?
Tatay.
Tagaytay. Si Blue.
Wow!
Si ate. Nak, si ate.
Ate.
Si kuya.
Papa.
Si lolo.
Baba.
Lola.
Baba.
Si dog.
Logo.
Si cat.
Cat.
Si chicken.
Cat.
Imitation, reinforcement, and analogy cannot account for language development because they are based on the implicit or explicit assumption that what the child acquires is a set of sentences or forms rather than a set of grammatical rules and linguistic structures. Now, next is knowing more than language. In knowing more than one language, people can acquire a second language under many different circumstances. You may have learned a second language when you began middle school or high school or college, and moving to a new country often means acquiring a new language. So, other people live in communities or homes in which more than one language is spoken and may acquire two or more languages simultaneously. So the term second language acquisition or L2 acquisition generally refers to the acquisition of a second language by someone, a adult or a child, who has already acquired a first language. So this is also referred to a sequential bilingualism. On the other hand, bilingual language acquisition refers to the more or less simultaneous acquisition of two languages beginning in infancy or before the age of 3 years, and also referred to as simultaneous bilingualism. Let's now jump to childhood bilingualism. Approximately half of the people in the world are native speakers of more than one language. So this means that as children, they had regular and continued exposure to those languages. So in many parts of the world, especially in Africa and Asia, bilingualism or multilingualism is the norm. So in contrast, many Western countries view themselves as monolingual, even though they may be home to, for example, United States and many European countries. Bilingualism is often viewed as a transit phenomenon and associated with migration. So bilingualism is an intriguing topic. So people wonder how it is possible for a child to acquire two or more languages at the same time. So in the early research into bilingualism focus on the fact that bilingual children sometimes mix the two languages in the same sentences. As the following examples from French-English bilingual children illustrate. So in the first example, a French word appears in an otherwise English sentence. In the other two examples, all of the words are English but the syntax is French. In early studies of bilingualism, this kind of language mixing was viewed negatively, and it was taken as an indication that the child was confused or having difficulty with the two languages. Or in fact, many parents, sometimes on the advice of educators or psychologists, would stop raising their children bilingually when faced with this issue. However, it now seems clear that some amount of language mixing is a normal part of the early bilingual acquisition and not an indication of any language problem. Indeed, various researchers have claimed that language mixing in bilingual children is similar to code switching, used by many adult bilinguals. That was discussed in chapter 7. So in specific social situations, bilingual adults may switch back and forth between their two languages. Is the same sentence. For example, I put forks in las mesas. Means I put the forks on the tables. Code switching reflects the grammars of both languages working simultaneously. So it is not bad grammar or broken English. And adult bilinguals code switch only when speaking to other bilingual speakers, and various studies have shown that bilingual children as young as to make contextually appropriate language choices. In speaking to monolinguals, the children use of one language, and in speaking to bilinguals, they mix the two languages. We have now here the theories of bilingual development. So, these mixed utterances raise an interesting question about the grammars of bilingual children. Does the bilingual child start out with only one grammar, eventually differentiated, or does she construct a separate grammar for each language right from the start? So here, the system hypothesis says that the child initially construct only one lexicon, and one grammar. So the presence of mixed utterances such as the ones just given is often taken as support for this hypothesis. So, in addition, at the early stages, bilingual children often have words for particular objects in only one language. For example, a Spanish-English bilingual child may know the Spanish word for milk as leche, but not the English word. Or she may have the word water, but not aqua. So this is a kind of complementary has also been taken as support for the idea that the child has only one lexicon. So the separate systems hypothesis says that the bilingual child builds a distinct lexicon and grammar for each language. To test the separate systems hypothesis, it is necessary to look at how the child acquires those pieces of grammar that are different in his two languages. For example, if both languages have SVO word order, this would be not a good place to test this hypothesis. So, there are several studies. Have shown that where the two language diverge, children acquire the different rules of each language. So, Spanish, English, and French, German bilingual children have been shown to use the word orders appropriate to each language, as well as the correct agreement morphemes for each language. So, other studies have found that children set up two distinct sets of phonemes and phonological rules for their languages. So, the separate systems hypothesis also receives support from the study of hearing children of deaf parents who are acquiring both signs and spoken languages. Two monolinguals in one head. Although we must study many bilingual children to reach any firm conclusions, the evidence accumulated so far seems to support the idea that children construct multiple grammars from the outset. And moreover, it seems that bilingual children develop their grammars along the same lines as monolingual children. They go through a bubbling stage, a holoplastic stage, a telegraphic stage, and so on. But during the telegraphic stage, they show the same characteristics in each of their languages as the monolingual children. So, the role of input. So, one issue that concerns researchers studying bilingualism as well as parents of bilingual children is the relationship between language input and proficiency. So, what role does the input play in helping the child to separate the two languages? So, one input condition that is thought to promote the bilingual development is un personi un language, or one person, one language. Mama speaks only language A to the child and dad speaks only language B. The idea is that keeping the two languages separate in the input will make it easier for the child to acquire each without influence from the other. So, whether this method influences bilingual development in some important way has not been established. So, in practice, this ideal input situation may be difficult to attain. We saw earlier that babies are attuned to various phonological properties of the input language such as prosody and phonotactics. So, various studies suggest that this sensitivity provides a sufficient basis for the bilingual child to keep the two languages separate. Another question is, how much input does a child need in each language to become native in both? So, the answer is not straightforward, and it seems intuitively clear that if a child that if a child hears 12 hours of English a day and only 2 hours Spanish, he will be probably develop he will be prob- he will probably develop English more quickly and completely than Spanish. Where in fact, under these conditions, he may never achieve the kind of grammatical competence in Spanish that we associate with the normal monolingual Spanish speaker. In reality, bilingual children are raised in a variety of circumstances. Some may have more or less equal exposure to the two languages, and some may hear one language more than the other, but still have sufficient input in the two languages to become native in both. Some may ultimately have one language that is dominant to a lesser or greater degree. Researchers simply do not know how much language exposure is necessary in the two languages to produce a balanced bilingual, although they are beginning to address this question. So, for now, the assumption is that the child should receive roughly equal amounts of input in the two languages to achieve native proficiency in both. Cognitive effects of bilingualism. So, another issue is the effect of bilingualism on the intellectual or cognitive development. Does being bilingual make you more or less intelligent, more or less creative, and so on? Historically, research into this question has been fraught with methodological difficulties and has often been heavily influenced by the prevailing political and social climate. So, many early studies in 1960s showed that bilingual children did worse than monolingual children on IQ and other cognitive and education tests. However, when other factors such as schooling and socioeconomic status were controlled for, these differences disappeared. More recent research indicates that bilingual children outperform monolinguals in certain kinds of problem solving. So, for example, bilingual children are better at accommodating to unpredictable rule changes in sorting games and other tasks. So they also seem to have better metalinguistic awareness, which refers to a speaker's conscious awareness about language rather than of language. So this is illustrated in the epigraph, this section. And finally, bilingual children have sufficient metalinguistic awareness to speak the contextually appropriate language as noted earlier. So, whether children enjoy some cognitive or educational benefit from being bilingual seems to depend in the part of extralinguistic factors such as the social and economic position of the child's group or community. So, the educational situation and the relative prestige of the two languages. And studies that show the most positive effects, better school performance generally involve children reared in societies where both languages are valued and whose parents were interested in and supportive of their bilingual development. Now, second language acquisition. So, in contrast to the bilinguals just discussed, many people are introduced to a second language, L2, after they have achieved native competence in the first language, L1. So, if you have had the experience of trying to master a second language as an adult, no doubt you found it to be a challenge quite unlike your first language experiences. We have here a question that is L2 acquisition the same as L1 acquisition? So, with some exceptions, adults do not simply pick up a second language. It is usually requires conscious attention if not intense study and memorization, to become a proficient in second language. Again, with the exception of some remarkable individuals, adult second language learners do not often achieve the native-like grammar competence in the L2, especially with respect to pronunciation. So they generally have an accent, and they may make syntactic or morphological errors that are unlike the errors of children. Acquiring their first language. So, most people fall somewhere in the middle. Success may depend on a range of factors including age, talent, motivation, and whether you are in the country where the language is spoken or sitting in a classroom 5 mornings a week with no further contact with native speakers. For all these reasons, many people, including many linguists who study L2 acquisition, believe that adult second language acquisition is something different from first language acquisition. So, this hypothesis is referred as the fundamental difference hypothesis of L2 acquisition. So, heritage language learners are particular kind of adult language learner. A heritage language learner is someone who was raised with a strong cultural connection to a language through family interaction. So for example, a language such as Polish is spoken by grandparents who were immigrants and who decides at some point to study the language more formally, for example in college. So the heritage language learner may have no prior linguistic knowledge of the language, or he may be bilingual to some degree in the heritage language or his weaker language and the dominant language, that is the language of the broader community. So for example, English. Often, heritage language learners can switch to another dominant language later in life. For example, when they enter school, at this point, they may begin to lose the heritage language. So, a process known as language attrition. Is there a critical period for L2 acquisition? So, age is a significant factor in L2 acquisition. So, the younger a person is when exposed to a second language, the more likely she is to achieve native-like competence. So, in a classic study of the effects of age on ultimate attainment in L2 acquisition, the researchers tested several groups of Chinese and Korean speakers who had acquired English as second language. The subjects, all of whom had been in the United States for at least 5 years, were tested on their knowledge of specific aspects of English morphology and syntax. So, the study showed that test results depended heavily on age at which the person